This is absurd, as we have had now multiple new reports just drop revealing some crazy information surrounding both Brad Treliving's plans as the trade deadline approaches, as well as the Flyers' asking price surrounding Scott Laughton. We're going to break down these reports and discuss what this means going forward as the Leafs prepare for something big. But before we get into it, if you're a part of the 70% who aren't subscribed to the channel, this is the place to be for daily Leafs content. So if you're part of that percentage, make sure to hit that subscribe button as we're on the road to 15,000 subscribers. There's a lot to go over today. Now, obviously, we've been discussing on this channel ad nauseum about whether it be Fraser Minten, whether it be Scott Laughton, and now we are in a very interesting point in time because the Four Nations Cup is just around the corner. And according to Elliot Freeman, like we covered in our video earlier, it seems to be that is kind of the deadline before the deadline, specifically surrounding the Toronto Maple Leafs here. So I'm going to break down some new reports for you. We'll start with this. My latest from Anthony DiMarco on Scott Laughton and regarding Scott Laughton. He goes on to say that it seems like Philly really likes Minten, but the Leafs will be in tough as 7 teams are showing interest in Scott Laughton. 4 teams are in on Ristolainen, with one of them telling Philly that retention may be involved. The ask starts with a first-round pick surrounding Ristolainen. So now the question is, we'll dive into some new reports in a minute here, Darius. It seems that a first-round pick for Ristolainen, you have, the Flyers reportedly wanting Fraser Minten in exchange for Scott Laughton. There is an opportunity and avenue here for a big deal to get done.
Well, one team is asking about retained salary for Ristolainen. I wonder who that team is. It's the Toronto Maple Leafs because it just doesn't work for them otherwise. So, something that has emerged in all of this, because through the weekend, we were like, okay, Scott Laughton is definitely going to end up being a Maple Leaf. And maybe it's Rasmus Ristolainen, maybe there's retained salary. And in that way, you're going to have to give up Fraser Minten, maybe a first round pick, something like that, because the Flyers really value Fraser Minten. We're going to get to that in a second as well. It looks like, if they're going to make this deal work, it might be Minten that's going the other way. But, the asking price for Scott Laughton as of today is absurd. It looks like it's a first round pick. And this is not including Rasmus Ristolainen and retained salary. It's a first round pick or a prospect of equal value. I think that is absurd for a third line center. I know a lot of teams are in the market for a third line center and they need guys who can come in and fill those roles at the NHL level right now heading into the playoffs. And I think that the Winnipeg Jets are probably involved in this as well. That's what we heard, a couple of days ago. Up to 7 teams are involved in this, right? But for that to be the asking price for Scott Laughton is absurd without Rasmus Ristolainen in the deal and without retained salary. So what's the deal with him included and retained salary? 2 first round picks, Fraser Minten as well. Like, I think things are getting a little out of hand. I think the Leafs are kind of, kicking tires on everybody right now. But if that is the report and that's what's come out today, that's the latest. I think that's an absurd asking price.
Yeah, it seems like a very, steep asking price, especially for a guy like Scott Laughton, who at this point in time, we were talking about maybe a second, third round pick, depending on how things are going. Now we're in the talks for not only Minten, but some other draft compensation as well on top of that. You see this here, this past Saturday, it was reported that Scott Laughton was generating an uptick in interest over the last little bit. Among teams heavily interested are the Leafs and the Jets, who both basically need a center down the middle of the ice, especially third line. In the case of the Leafs, a third line center has been the focal point for the past several seasons. You think back to Ryan O'Reilly, the move helped catapult the Leafs into the second round for the first time. Some believe that the Leafs should shoot higher than Laughton and look for a second line center, which is some of the reports that have come out recently as well. So now you're thinking about both pursuing a second line center. You have some reports about a third line center. Things are getting very interesting. And Max Domi as well, potentially being shifted in a trade. And as for the actual return, Fraser Minten's name has been tied to the Flyers, given the team's lack of center depth. Minten would check a much-needed box in the pipeline. Overall, a first-round selection is what the Flyers will want as a starting point, not the end-all in a package for Scott Laughton. The Leafs do not have a first-round pick in 2025, but the Flyers are open to the pick being in 2026 too. So a lot to dissect here. So 1, they're looking for Fraser Minten. 2, they're open to picks beyond 2025. Now, obviously, they're not going to be Minten plus. Fraser Minten in this scenario acts like a first-round pick. I would at least hope so, that Brad Treliving wouldn't make a deal, for Scott Laughton with multiple players involved or multiple picks. However, I'll ask you now, a deal including Ristolainen alongside Fraser Minten, like Minten and a first in 2026 for Ristolainen and Scott Laughton, is that something that intrigues you? Let us know down below as well. That's the big question mark.
That's still a bit steep, right? And I think I'm more open to trading a first round pick at this point because you don't know what that player is going to be. You know what you have in Fraser Minten. I've been saying if you can get a second line center, you can have Austin Matthews, Fraser Minten there, John Tavares. I think that's John Tavares moving to the wing, and you would have that second line center with Austin Matthews. I think that's a better look. The other thing in this report as well is the Flyers are not necessarily open to retaining salary on Scott Laughton, but they would be interested in taking back salary like a David Kampf contract. So I think that makes things very interesting for the Leafs because, if you're sending Kampf the other way, you don't have to retain salary. That would just make sense, right? They can afford that. So I think that's another interesting monkey wrench into the whole situation here as well. But I'm not comfortable giving up Fraser Minten at this point in time. I think I'm more comfortable, and I understand the Flyers need. I think I'm more comfortable actually giving up Easton Cowan, but the Flyers would want a center in return. They want Fraser Minten in this deal. But again, retain salary, like on paper, right? Scott Laughton coming in, Rasmus Ristolainen coming in on retained salary to make it work for the team makes this team a lot better. It does, right? But giving up Fraser Minten a first round pick, maybe two first round picks, like I don't know about that deal at this point. I feel like that the asking price is far too high. Maybe other teams are willing to pay that, but maybe that's why we haven't seen a trade come down yet. So I feel like some of these asking prices are absurd because, in the last couple seasons, you see, centermen go for, I know Sean Monahan went for a first round pick, right? For example, but I feel like, he could play second line center. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out. And again, I think that the Leafs, there's a lot of guys that they've been talking about, and the Leafs have been, discussing. We hear a lot of reports about them wanting to go out and get a second line center and really bolstering that up and fixing that for the future, like a Dylan Cousins, for example. A lot of the names we're hearing, Ryan O'Reilly, right? Scott Laughton, Braden Shen, for example, too. Are they better than John Tavares? I don't think so.
Yeah, and the second line center is you then have to value some of the, A, the asking price for the second line centers, and B, how much better would they be than John Tavares? And then you can also think about if they have term in the future. You can see this here from another account. Definitely feels like we're getting a Laughton Ristolainen deal in the near future. Laughton was almost a Leaf, and Dubas was interested in Ristolainen a couple years ago too. Living tried to trade for him when he was in Calgary and last year when he was with the Leafs. A lot of smoke here. That dropped today as well. It seemed like there's a relationship between this. It seems like Kyle, the Leafs are a perfect fit for Scott Laughton. We've been discussing a Scott Laughton trade for a very long time here on this channel. He seems like the number one target. You were on it before a lot of these reports had started to be, and kind of diving more in depth about this. There was a rumor floating around in Calgary years ago that Treliving got very close to pulling the trigger with Buffalo for Ristolainen until Chris Snow caught wind of it and essentially put his foot down. So I think in any deal here, it's not only it's Scott Laughton, but it's also Rasmus Ristolainen, which is why we're probably hearing Fraser Minten's name be thrown around, because in a deal with Laughton and Ristolainen, it might be a little bit easier to stomach Fraser Minten heading the other way. The real question is, what would it be alongside Fraser Minten in order to make that happen? And obviously the salaries are a thing, maybe Max Domi heading the other way. Any final thoughts on this before I wrap up? It seems like any part of this deal will be, of course, with Rasmus Ristolainen. You can see that tweet was from 2023, and now we're talking about it in 2025.
That's right. And we were talking about this last season as well, heading to the deadline, that Scott Laughton was another option for the Leafs. But, all in all, looking at this, I do think that Scott Laughton is going to end up a Toronto Maple Leaf. I do believe that heading into this year's playoffs, this most likely scenario. Getting a second line center might be too expensive. They have to get too creative. And I don't know if that's in Brad Treliving's DNA at this point. But the asking price, that is steep. I don't know if I want to move off of Fraser Minten at this point in time. I think he can be a really good third line center for this team. And, I think the real hangup here is maybe the lack of first round pick this year for the Toronto Maple Leafs, right? But I would be open, if Philly wants to, a prospect that's not named Easton Cowan or Fraser Minten and a first round pick. Maybe something else, right? From the Marley system too, or maybe a guy who hasn't made it yet, maybe like an 18 or 19-year-old. A prospect in that way and retain salary. If they're able to do that, I think that's a tidy deal. I think you can do that, but the Flyers have needs and they're asking for Fraser Minten, so it's going to get interesting. And the Leafs are in win now mode. I do say this because I'm protective of the future to a degree, but we all have to remember the Leafs they have to win a Stanley Cup in the next 2 years. So I think Scott Laughton's going to end up the Toronto Maple Leaf.
Keep you up to date with all the latest news. So make sure to hit the subscribe button. Let us know down below what your thoughts are on this. Cheers.